We have a John Deere D130. Customer brought it in and said that the local dealer had taken a look at it and said that quite a few things were wrong with it when they sent it in for a tune-up. We're going to check this thing out, do a full diagnosis on it, and figure out what exactly is going on. The first thing we did was check the battery. Now the battery is a strong box from 423, 350 cold cranking amps it looks like. All of the battery connections are tight, no issues. And then on the other side, the connections on the solenoid are tight. Now if you follow that positive down, you'll see the solenoid. Got your two hot posts. Well, the one's hot on the far side. And then you've got your wires going to it. Now, they're saying the low speed compression release is bad on this thing. When we go to turn this over, it does seem like it's a little bit difficult to turn. Let's see what happens when we try to turn the key. Now we're getting some catching. So it just started, as you saw, quite a few times, turned over great quite a few times, but now as I'm trying to turn it, it's getting hung up just every now and again. With them saying that's a low speed compression release issue, I don't really think so. Probably got an issue somewhat like we did on another video with the valve spaces. We're going to check this out and see if that's the issue. This has 12.8 or so volts to it. Now, if you don't know or have a voltmeter around, that is the first thing I would do, is get that tested. A lot of times it's going to be a battery issue or a ground issue where the negative comes back down. You can see it bolts to the frame at the bottom, right in here. If that is loose at all, you'll get kind of the same issue. You also will if you've got a bad battery. Could also be an issue with the safety switches. Now, you can test your voltage here. If you're getting 12 volts when you're turning the key and the parking brake's on, then you know that the solenoid is getting voltage. Now, the solenoid could be bad. That could be one of the issues. You can test that very easily in a case like this by just jumping it across. Now this is just giving power directly to the starter. At right this second, I have the key turned off. Now if I do this, it's just gonna turn it over, but it's not gonna start. Well, you see there that it doesn't really want to turn over. It's one of those things where it's every now and again. Even when it's getting the full voltage from the battery. Now if you jump that solenoid on the other side and it fired up, but nothing happens when you turn the key even though you're getting 12 volts to it, you know you need to replace the solenoid. Pretty easy there. These are 3/8 bolts. We're going to check both of the valves on both sides on this. A lot of times what will happen is the valves will loosen up on these things after a couple hundred hours. And you'll run into an issue where it can't turn past the compression strokes. These have not been pulled off. So the other place definitely didn't actually look at the valves at all. I'm not sure how you diagnose a low speed compression release issue like that without actually pulling out and looking at it. Actually doesn't seem horrible. Now these are supposed to be anywhere from 4 to 6 thousandths as far as the gap goes. You can adjust these pretty easily. Now that's, I'm testing at 5 thousandths there, and it did go pretty smooth. 7 thousandths. So yeah, it's definitely, let's see, 10 thousandths. So that's 12 thousandths. So it's definitely out of adjustment. Get this adjusted back to do about 5 thousandths for the adjustment. We have our 13mm wrench to hold onto the outside. Now on this, you can do one of two things to adjust these valves. You can take the spark plug out and you can stick something down in the spark plug hole, find your compression stroke, and come up to where your piston is all the way out, and then continue to turn your engine until whatever you're sticking in there goes a 1/4 inch back into the engine. So say you're turning it over, you turn clockwise from the top, the piston comes all the way back this way, you'd mark here, and as the piston starts to go back in, a 1/4 inch past that, so say from here to here, would be, you know, where you would eventually adjust the valves at. Everyone will argue that as long as one valve is in on this camshaft, the other valve will be released. Yes, that is true. It is not how they recommend setting them, but it will set just fine that way. And really there's no workable difference. I usually set them by going a 1/4 inch past, top dead center. Today, it's not how we're gonna do it. So this valve's all the way in. We're going to adjust the exhaust valve. We're going to 5 thousandths. Now as you hold your T40 in that spot, you're gonna tighten the nut against it. And then you're gonna recheck after it's tight. Perfect. Just make sure that's nice and tight still. And you're basically turning your 13 into a tightening motion, and you're holding your T40 to make sure it doesn't move in the spot that it's in. Again, that's perfect. Going to turn this over and adjust the other side. Now that valve's all the way in, and I'm just turning the engine at the top in order to get these valves to move. Crack that loose. Screw this in until we get about where we need to be. You want it to be able to go in there, but kind of tight. If you get in here and any of these push rods are off or anything like that, you want to make sure that you address those. Also check the studs. These two 8mm studs, if they start to back out, that one's a little bit loose, I'd say still. Pop it back off. Tighten it up a little bit more. Okay. That's about perfect. We will want to clean all of this up because this doesn't have gaskets on it, and we're going to put some new gaskets on it here in just a minute. I'll show you the part number and everything for those. We stock them. But right now, just for diagnostic purposes for the customer and figuring out what's going on, we're going to start with adjusting these valves. After we get the other side adjusted, I will show you how you can tell if your low speed compression release is working. Don't over tighten those. It is easier also to turn the engine over by hand if you have the spark plugs out. 3/8 bolts out on this side. Obviously, always check your oil before you do anything like this. You could have an issue where the crankcase has been flooded and you've actually got gas inside the oil. Not the case here, everything's good. We always check them before we start them. This one is also still sealed on this side. That means that they diagnosed it as a low speed compression release issue without actually doing any further investigation. We usually try to just pry something down in there and then just barely twist it to the side, or there we go. and kind of loose over here. Okay. Get that bottom one adjusted real quick. Still kind of loose. About perfect. I think, man, I don't, almost seems like we want to go just a hair further. Let me see if I can tighten all this up just a smidge. Oh yeah, that's about right. Okay. It's definitely very loose also. Again, check your studs, make sure that they're nice and tight before you put all this back together. A lot of times they'll back out, but normally if they back out, you'll have a gap on them, normally about 1/4 inch or more. That or one of the rods will have popped off or something like that, in most cases anyway. Still just a tiny bit loose. There we are. Okay. Let's see what we got there. The low-speed compression release on these units works off of the intake valve. What happens is it opens about 1/100 of an inch to release the compression of the unit if it's traveling at a slow speed. Now if we see the exhaust valve go in, now it's closing, your intake valve will start to go in. Once it comes back up, it will, for a split second after it comes up, it'll go back in order to release that compression if you're going at a slow speed. Let me see if I turn this over what kind of view we can get there. There we go. Now that we've got the valves adjusted and we have confirmed that the low speed compression release is working, that it is not bad, let's go ahead and try turning this thing over quite a few times and see what happens. See if it turns over every time, or turning it over super slow. I just keep hitting the key, and I mean it's not stopping anywhere, not getting caught on anything. It's running, another thing I can tell is it sounds like it's running on one cylinder. No spark on this side whatsoever. if I had to guess, the coil's bad. Let's take the spark plug out real quick and see what it looks like. Oh, completely loose, so that's good. Seems to me like maybe somebody's been in here or checked this recently. Was not us. Look at that, brand new spark plug. At least that's what it looks like. I'm still gonna throw one of our 491055Ts in it, just because I don't know where that spark plug came from. Just always a good practice. No spark. Let's take the top off and figure out exactly what's going on there. Just some 3/8 and 5/16 bolts holding everything on. 4 on the top. A couple for the fuel pump. So a bunch of these that have spacers for the housing. And then you will also have to take the top air cleaner cover off. And the air cleaner out, and there are 2 1/4-inch screws that go straight down through and connect from the top and screw into the carburetor. Little plastic screws. They're not plastic screws, but they're threaded for going into plastic. And then this all just pulls straight up and off, out of the way. Just had one like this last week, ended up being a bad kill wire. Let's take this off. Looks like it's got a little keeper on it, so you've got to push the tab to pull it off. And just a little tab right there. You push that in order to pull that straight off. Pretty self-explanatory. I'm gonna pull the plug wire off. I'm just turning this around. I'm making sure that the gap looks good in between the coil and the magnet. As long as there's light showing through there and it's not super far away, you should be good. There's a big buildup of rust, you can sand that down. Honestly, it's not gonna make any difference at all. Let's see, now with the coil unplugged, I'm gonna first test it out to the side, and then I'm gonna test it under compression. Just gonna hold this side here. Yeah, that's going back to the spark plug, so that might work. Let's see what that does for us. I'll pull the other plug off. Make sure it doesn't start. I'm not seeing anything out of the spark plug. See what the spark shows us. Absolutely nothing in this case. The ignition coil is also bad. Not only was the valve hanging us up with the extra compression because the valves weren't adjusted right, the ignition coil is also bad. This is a very common issue where people think they have low power because of something else. You know, just need to tune up this, that, or the other. But if you're not getting your machine fully checked out by whoever you're taking it to, you're never going to realize that these things are happening. You know, this thing with 12.5 horsepower on a 42-inch deck, for most homeowners that are only mowing a few inches, it's going to be fine. They're still going to be continuing to run and run and run it until someone tells them they have an issue. We're going to get a coil in for this, and we'll get it put back together and finished up. We have the ignition coil in. We're going to go ahead and replace the rocker cover gaskets. I've opened both sides and checked the valve clearance again. I always like to run them for about 5 minutes or so, double check everything's good again, and switch them out, especially in a case like this where you've already got it open once and then you're going to be getting it open again. These are 690971 rocker cover gaskets. All you're going to want to do is just take a razor blade, clean all the way around. Now you can take a towel or a rag, just kind of put it up on top, keep you from getting anything down in the engine. But just work that razor blade all the way around. It takes it off well on this side. On the other side, I like to use like a brass wire brush and just kind of brush it off. Doesn't take too much time there. But if you double check these, that just ensures that you've got everything tight and that nothing's moved after it's ran there for a minute. It will point out another issue if you've got a sticking valve or something like that in most cases. For the ignition coil, armature-magneto they call it, 592846 is the part number. It looks similar to the other one, doesn't look exactly the same. Comes with a couple new bolts and 4 washers, and it looks like a couple tabs of instructions. How to mess with that if you want to put a different end on. That one's okay. It's telling you here that if it doesn't fit, you may have to do some blower housing modifications. I think ours is pretty free up underneath, and ours isn't a single cylinder like this is anyway. And then it tells you if it doesn't fit in between your 2 posts there, you may have to do some trimming out. Don't believe that's going to be the case here either. It does tell us to install 2 washers under each of the screw heads and torque to 30 inch-pounds. Now this will be what you use to space it. Take those 2 out. Now we are going to take the boot off of the old one. For some reason Briggs coils a lot of times don't come with the boots. I'm just gonna throw that on there. Make sure this fits well. It does, fits down in there with plenty of space. We'll plug this in to our kill. And then we're gonna rotate it around to where our magnet is. For the sake of all you out there that like me to clean a magnet, I'll get it nice and clean here for us. This is not going to make a difference in the magnetic field, but a lot of people were taught to sand the magnet by the old head, so it's something they still do. There we are. And if I had to guess, these bolts that come with it are a little bit longer. They've got a little tab. Yeah, so that's why they want us to put the 2 washers up underneath to make sure it doesn't bottom out. I always like to use a nut driver for something like this. You don't want to over tighten it. Just hold that up against that coil with the card in between there, nice and tight. Go ahead and snug those up. Again, it says 30 inch-pounds. Don't over tighten them. Don't use hand tools. Slipped off of that one. Now if you look in between these, if you take a flashlight or something like that and shine right down below and you look straight up and down through, you should be able to see light through there in between them. If you can't, it's going to be too close. Looks about perfect. Almost seems a little close on this side, but I'm not really too worried about it. All right. I can see light down through. It's always good. Well, let's test if we have spark here. We've got spark now on this side. It fired up right off the bat without choking or anything like that. This thing wants to run. We're getting good spark. We'll check that with the plug out to the side. You can visibly see what exactly you should see. Now, if I can keep this out away from, should be about perfect. See if we can't see that spark going. So you can see it real nice and that's what you should be seeing out of a mower when you're turning it over and checking the spark onto the block. Now that does seem a little bit long. Kind of route it down in here, keep it away from anything. It's not long enough where it can even get into the fan, so we're not too worried about it, but we don't want it to get pinched when we put our top cover back on. Now that everything's back together like it should be, we'll do one final test run here, get everything power washed and cleaned up. Before we put this all together, we did go ahead and blow out all up underneath everything, clean out the intake here, especially where it likes to build up before it gets to the air cleaner. You want to make sure that's all nice and clean. This is all buttoned up nice, no wires pinched on either side. Want to make sure these wires stay in also, otherwise it's going to ground out, ruin your coil, or your charging system. There's many different things that could happen if you get wires pinched. Definitely a nightmare. You don't want it to happen. Let's test and fire this thing up. I'm gonna run on this cylinder independently here for just a second. All right, so that one's good. We already know the other one was good from before. Fire it up at full throttle and see how it sounds. We're getting quite a bit of smoking from it. That's very, very common on something like this, especially when a cylinder hasn't been ran in quite a while. When we removed the other spark plug had carbon all over it. This spark plug, I believe last time probably that it was tuned up before they sent it in this time. Both of the plugs were changed and this cylinder wasn't running from that time on, from what the evidence is telling me anyway. Hopefully this helps you if you're having an issue with your mower with the starter hanging up or not turning over, and it gets you back into action. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe.